Well, here we are again, my druies. I hope you enjoy the show, or shall I say, the horror show. I'm ahead of the curve, also known as James Bergman. In this review, I will be discussing A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. And it was first published in 1962. So I've got quite the history with this piece in particular, because this was one of the first books that I actually read that first got me into literature. And I must have read it when I was maybe 15, perhaps, or 14. I remember going to the school library and I talked to an English teacher there, and I mentioned A Clockwork Orange to him if he's ever seen the film, and he said, "Yeah, have you read the book?" And I was like, "Well, no," because at the time I didn't really read, to be honest. I never read actual literature. I mean, at that age anyway. At that point, I was reading probably self-help books. I don't know, like business sales books, given to me by my dad. But at the time, yeah, I wasn't really reading any literature of any sorts. And so the teacher went and got A Clockwork Orange for me on the shelves of this library from the school. And yeah, I read it over probably a span of weeks. My reading pace was not very fast at that particular time, obviously. And so, yeah, I did take a while to actually finish it. But because I loved the film so much by Stanley Kubrick, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. Anyway, I also love The Shining. The Shining is brilliant. But anyway, we won't go into that. So, yeah, I watched the film, and at the time I was just entranced by it. I loved the aesthetic. I loved the whole meaning of the film. And I will get into the meaning of this book as well. But yeah, like my history with it, I've got a soft spot for A Clockwork Orange. To be honest, I prefer the film to the book, but the book in itself is its own beast, I think, because they both tell slightly different stories. And the title is actually, and the author even said the title is derived from, well, A Clockwork Orange is to say that to try and make something natural, such as an orange, into something mechanical. And that's what they were trying to do to Alex throughout the story. They were effectively trying to turn this young man into a moist robot, as such, to try and get him to follow what society wanted. And obviously he was rebelling against that, I suppose, indirectly or subconsciously, or maybe even consciously, because he did enjoy it. To a point. And so, yeah, I mean, the story just follows that he does what he wants until he gets repercussions. But, I mean, this is where the book and the film differ. And, yeah, I mean, I'm being a bit sporadic at the moment, but that's only because I wanted to introduce my my actual history with the piece, because I have read this about 3 times now, and I still feel like there's more to pick up from the book, because when you read this, it's very difficult at times, because the author mixed English and Russian words together to formulate this piece, and I found that really, really interesting, because Burgess was a linguist, so he actually admitted that he wanted to write a story that intertwined both languages, and he used his main character as a conduit from that. But the book is also set in the future, which means that language would probably be different, right? The book isn't so obvious about this. I mean, the film is much more obvious about it being kind of futuristic. For example, the car that they're driving towards the beginning, to the home, to attack the couple. And the aesthetic is obviously quite different, quite futuristic. Throughout this review, I want to talk a bit about the film and the book, because I feel like that the differences are really, really interesting, because So I'm not going to have any set format, I guess, for this, like my usual videos. I'm just going to have a sort of a discussion, an open discussion, with myself, but also you. I like how the book is much more focused on language, and I also like, and this is going to be spoilers, by the way, I also like how at the end of the piece, it skips some years forward when Alex is 18, because in the book he's, what, like 15? And he discovers, so not only did Georgie die in prison, which isn't shown in the film, but his fellow droogs, they actually, well, one of them gets married, for example, and then Alex starts to think, well, maybe I should have children, maybe I should try and start a family, because the last chapter starts with a new gang, right, of his droogs, and it seems like Alex is being much more reflective of the implications of what he's doing and maybe what it all means, which is, like, fair enough, right? Because there does come a point when you do whatever you do and you start to question whether you should keep on doing it. Or at least, you know, if you're conscientious enough. And so I just found it very interesting how at the very, very end, Alex is questioning whether he does want to carry on doing this and whether he should choose a different path. And I think this is the most interesting, maybe one of the most interesting parts about this story in general, is that the scientists or the doctors, they were trying to force him to change. And the truth of reality, it seems to me, is that you can't force anybody to change as such. You can only open some doors for them. And even if you open a door for somebody, that doesn't mean they're even going to walk through it. And so, really, it seemed to me by the end of the book that Alex had to find his own way. He had to discover for himself that what he was doing probably wasn't ideal for anyone. And so he changes as a person, I suppose, mentally. And then if the book went any further, he'd probably change his lifestyle and maybe try and even get married and so on, have a child. And it's interesting because the last chapter was released in, well, about 20 years after the book was originally released. And when it was originally brought out in the US, it didn't actually have that last chapter. So the chapter before the last one ends where where the film does. And at that point you think, well, you know, he's not going to change, blah, blah, blah. But the book sort of has a more sentimental value, a more meaningful, productive ending. And it's also interesting because throughout this entire story, with both the film and the book, it seemed to me that it was a critique of not only trying to take away the free will of individuals through science and, you know, conditioning, like, you know, Pavlov's dogs, for example, but it was also an exposure of the organized societal departments, right? And what I mean by this is that, for example, in the film, when there's a scene when Alex is in the hospital bed, the man and the woman, both doctors, they're kind of getting it on behind the curtains, and then they, you know, run out when he regains consciousness. And so there's that, which is a minute example, fair enough. But when we look back to the practicing of trying to cure him, you know, the doctors are very corrupt, the prison officers are corrupt. And even the school, the guy who's very creepy in the film, kind of like a paedophile sort of figure, but he was corrupt because he was obviously, like, you know, groping Alex and so on. So it seems to me that both narratives are exposing how we're all just mammals, and we're all just mammals trying to create our little substructures and trying to be organized and trying to actively separate ourselves from animals, when really we're just denying that we are animals, right? And so I liked how both stories exposed organized attempts to change man's nature, or to at least regulate it with a neutral stance, because, as discussed, that is impossible. And so, and also, if it breaches that, if it is breached, and if we can do something with neutrality, again, it's trying to turn something natural like an orange into a clockwork orange. And so, again, there are so many interesting themes in the book, so many themes. And going back to the history of the piece as well, in Britain, when I believe when the film came out, I think it was when the film came out, in the UK, London, it was actually banned for a while because people were going out, young people were going out, dressing up like Alex DeLarge, dressing up like the Drews, and wreaking havoc. And I think this is sort of a symbolism of how it's so easy to identify with Alex. Because whilst he is obviously being very violent, very destructive, he's also got this charisma. He's got a magical intuition for wordplay. And you can sort of respect that, because as a young person in the book, 15, or in the film, in his 20s maybe, nevertheless, you can admire that in a person such of his age, because, of course, that is not easy, right? To sort of have a sophisticated set of language skills. And so Alex does have charisma. He also in a sense does have a heart, but it's very corrupted by, and I would argue, by just the society that it was brought up in. And then obviously the question then goes, well, nature or nurture? And I've always said in all of my classes at university, and so on, that it's always going to be a bit of both, right? So, but in this case, you can really tell how Alex has been obviously influenced from his nurturing, and his mother and father, again, in the film, are very caring, but at the same time very tolerant of him. So he's been allowed to get away with a lot of things, right? And the thing is with society as well, they're very sort of anti-young. If we remember the well, not that it's necessarily an example of anti-young, but the woman that Alex kills accidentally with a phallic statue in the film, but I think it was a bust of Beethoven in the book, which is quite interesting. Crazy cat lady. But yeah, she was sort of commenting on how, I mean, also the homeless man as well, previously. They're all talking about how the young are corrupted, the young are where the issue is. And I kind of commented on this in a short story that I wrote called The Final Death Rattle, which by the time of this releasing, my narration of the piece will be out on my channel. It's only about, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. It's very short. But in that, I briefly I briefly sort of note the character in that notes how effectively the youthful are ignorant of the old, and the old are ignorant of the youth. And I constantly see this, because the reason for this is that the older are stuck in their own ways. They don't want to change their thoughts. It's very rare that they do, because effectively they're living in the past, right? Because when they were younger, they had all their axioms put together and all their meanings put together and all the archetypes of life. So by the time that they're maybe about 70, 80, beyond, they are stuck in their own ways. They're not willing to be open-minded. I know I'm generalizing here, but from my experience, that's the case. And equally, the youth are very discriminative of the old, and they don't particularly care for them. And I think that this is a really interesting divide, because in a sense, they both need each other. But I tell you what, and this is my theory, it's that because we have the internet, we don't even need elders to give us information anymore, because we have Google, right? The elder are, in a sense, in the strictest sense for wisdom, they are a bit arbitrary now. And that isn't to say that I don't value a person's opinion when they're older. I personally very much do. I love talking to older people myself. But I have to say that the demand for knowledge from our elders is very much diminished by the fact that we have information just at our fingertips, right? So, yeah, this is my line of thought when it comes to the dialogue of the young and the old in this book. Again, it's a very subtle idea throughout both the film and the book. but I feel that it carries a lot of philosophical weight at the same time. Regarding the language in the book, I didn't really find it too bad. I mean, it was quite hard to pick up on at times, which is why I do think that this book is one that you have to reread quite a few times to fully grasp what it's trying to say, you know? Because it is a mix of Russian and English, and obviously it's set in a different time, it's very interpretive of what Alex is trying to say sometimes. And sometimes the small details are hard to pick up on in the book. Whereas in the film, it's much more straightforward because obviously you're seeing it play out. Whereas in the book, you have to read into it. You have to read between the lines, right? And so for me, that was quite difficult. Not too difficult, and not that it is a detriment to the piece, I think, because I think the language within the book is one of the great advantages of it. That's what sets it apart from any other piece of literature. It's literally that the author made his own language, effectively. And that's also a reason why I really enjoy Blindness by... Where's Blindness? Jose Saramago, yeah. Yeah, that's why I enjoy Blindness, which is also one of my favourite books. It's just absolutely brilliant. I'd recommend that to anyone who hasn't read that yet. But again, the language, I'm not going to spoil that book, but the language is... The writing is in such a way that it makes sense to the narrative. The same way that A Clockwork Orange is written in this way. And I love it when an author sort of does this, because they are inherently separating their book instantaneously from all the others, really. And whilst you could say it's pretentious, and a lot of people may say that about A Clockwork Orange, I feel that they're probably just bitter because they didn't understand what the fuck they were reading. Yeah, A Clockwork Orange, in my heart, it's kind of a favourite of mine, but I must admit, though, that the book, even though it's not very long as well, the book is only like 150 pages. It's like a novella sort of thing, almost. But I must say that I enjoy watching the film a lot more. That's because the soundtrack, that's because the imagery, the acting, and so on. But the ending... Yeah, I mean... I appreciate both endings. I feel that they both serve their purpose, because they're both telling you a different story about humanity. Because in A Clockwork Orange film, it's effectively saying that man cannot change. It's very Freudian. Man cannot escape his true nature. Even if you try and contrive, have therapy, sort of assessments, and realize more about yourself, people never change, they just become more of who they really are. So I feel that the film is trying to make that point, whereas the book is making the point that man can change, he can see the error of his ways, but not from somebody else forcing him to. We have to see the errors in our ways by ourselves, unless we're, of course, very conscientious and we listen to other people and we actually take that on board, which is quite rare and very difficult. So I appreciate the meaning of both the film and the book. And yeah, like I said, I enjoy the film a lot more for many reasons. But the book is still like a classic piece of literature. It's the fact that it is short as well makes it much more tolerable, I think. Because if it was a lot longer, then I'd probably get a bit, frustrated at trying to interpret what the heck it's saying. But because it is so short, I can justify that, right? Oh, and by the way, I'm not actually drinking cow's milk. Many of you know that I'm vegan, so this is oat milk. But yeah, I think that is about all I have to say for this review. I know this is a long time coming, because I originally read this maybe a month or so ago. And on the podcast, as many of you will watch, we were planning to have a full episode on A Clockwork Orange, but we, we were just being very disorganized, as usual. And we ended up talking about A Clockwork Orange for the first hour and a half, maybe. But then it just went off topic. But if you do want to watch the podcast episode where we do talk about that, then you'll find that probably via the thumbnail on my channel. But it's podcast episode, I don't know, 21 or 2. I don't know at this point. But also don't mind my mic not working for the 40 minutes or so that it didn't work. But yeah, all of this is a sidetrack. But if you want to hear me talk more about A Clockwork Orange and GC McKay and Cody Sexton, fellow bastards, if you want more discussion on that, then you can go to the podcast episode to do so. Yeah, I'm sorry that this took so long to publish or to film. It's just I have a lot of other books to read and a lot of things to film and to do. So yeah, I will see you in the next review. Check out my description for my Goodreads account to track what I read. Of course, check out the podcast, as I mentioned, and also consider checking out my Patreon account to donate to me. You get many benefits from doing so. That is also linked in the description. Yeah, thank you for watching, my Drews, and I will see you in the next review. Au revoir.